Thank you so much for coming, everybody. We'll get started and inevitably others will join, but we've got a great set of presentations today and we can get started with everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Really, really lovely to see folks here for what we're really excited about at Landscape Research as a launch of our newest special issue. So the special issue is called Emerging Voices, and I won't describe the issue at all. That there's, I'll hand it over to the editors for that. But the issue is a really exciting one. You know, every issue is exciting, but this one I think has a really interesting perspective and is put together in a really interesting way, and showcases a lot of what Landscape Research is as a journal and what we aim to do as a journal within kind of overall landscape research space. So I'm really excited that we're able to showcase some of the work going to be in that issue. I'll maybe make a quick note that this is actually a sneak peek of the issue. It will come out shortly. It's not quite out yet, but some of the papers are out yet, the ones that we'll be speaking about today. And so I'll share those, and then we'll share along social media channels and to our members and email lists the issue when it comes out. And it's always available on our website as soon as it comes out as well. Great. So in terms of format for today, we're going to be doing the editors, Emma Waterton, Paul Brindley, Vanicka, Arora will be doing a quick introduction to the issue and the structure of the issue and maybe what brought the issue about. And then each of the four presenters today that will be introduced shortly will have 7-minute presentations, and then there'll be some prepared questions from the editors and then questions from whoever in the audience would like to ask questions. So make sure if you have questions about one of the papers and you want to ask it, write it down for yourself, or you could put it in the chat right away, and we'll come back to those in the chat. Or of course, it's always preferable if you have papers across all of the, or if you have questions across all of the papers. I think sometimes that's the nicest type of question that sparks the most interesting conversation, but maybe put those in the chat, or if you want to say it out loud, you're welcome to unmute at the end of the presentation. But if you want to put it in the chat as you're thinking of it, that's totally fine. You can do that whenever. We'll make sure those get read out. And there will be, just in terms of other things that, housekeeping things, we're recording this event. So if you don't want to be in the recording in any way, it's best to just keep your video off, but we are recording the event. You're welcome to keep your video on, but it's best if you don't want to appear in it to keep that off. And then I think I already explained how to ask questions. If there are questions for me, feel free to put them in the chat, or Charlotte, who I'll pass things to right now to speak a little bit more about landscape research.
Thank you, Zana, and a big thanks to everyone here today joining us, and especially to our speakers. Just before we get started, I just want to take a little moment to encourage those of you that aren't members of our landscape community here at LRG to encourage you to do so, to have a think about it. We're a registered charity, and we came into existence in 1967, and everything that we do is for the benefit of our members, who span 43 different countries and come from a variety of different backgrounds, from landscape architects to geographers, artists, geologists, archaeologists, many of whom are from practice and some of whom are also from academia. So there's a really lovely mix of different people in our organisation. As a member, you'll have access to the full digital back catalogue of landscape research, and if you prefer, you can also get paper copies too going forward, as well as access to 5 other publications. You can apply to our research fund each spring. You can take part in our critical field studies. In fact, in 2 weeks we have a very exciting critical field study that's off to Cairo. You can attend conferences, have opportunities to network, and you can even put yourself forward to be on our board. I'll pop a link into the chat, so if anybody wants to explore it more or has any questions, please get in contact with me. But with no further ado, I'll hand over to Emma to get started. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Zana and Charlotte, for the introductions. Thanks to our speakers for coming today, and thanks everyone else for joining us to hear about this special issue, which keep refreshing. If it happens to pop onto the LR website, I'll let you know during the course of the Zoom. So Vanicka, Paul and I will just quickly take about 5 minutes of your time to talk you through the issue itself before we hand over to our speakers. But so I'll tell you a little bit about what prompted us to go down this road with this particular theme. Vanicka will tell you about the inspiration behind the format that we adopted, and Paul will tell you a little bit about the issue itself. But the focus on emerging voices is really part of a broader sort of approach the journal adopted in about 2020, which was to sort of adopt an ethos of care when it comes to the sort of cutthroat process of academic publishing. So we wanted to try to make the whole process just a little bit kinder, if we could. And we did various things to help support that initiative. And one of those things was to try to come up with something that we could do that would support early career researchers. We all know that ECRs face many, many challenges. Fractional contracts, casualization. Often universities have small pots of money available for researchers, but that tends not to be available to people who are on contracts. So we could see this sort of situation unfolding around us that was quite unkind to PhD students and ECRs, and we wanted to do something even in a small way to challenge some of those pressures, particularly that pressure to publish or perish, which we're all familiar with. So we decided to create something that could offer additional layers of support through the peer review process in our journal, Landscape Research. So Vanicka, Paul and I are all part of the editorial team at Landscape Research. So we got together and decided to put this special issue together, but the inspiration is not our own. So I'll hand over to Vanicka to tell you a little bit more about exactly how we came to the format, which is quite different to the usual format peer review process with the journal.
Thanks, Emma. Thanks, Charlotte, and thanks, Anna, and thanks for the speakers too, and the authors. Really, it's really nice working with all of you over the past. It seems like forever, and but I'm really glad to see you in 2D, if not 3D. We, as Emma said, we kind of looked around at other models of more supportive publishing that's going around now. I myself had participated as an ECR. Technically, I still am an ECR, even though I probably would qualify as a mid-career professional. I'm an early career academic. So disaster prevention and management, which is a different journal, which I had written for in 2022, published its own 2-part special issue called Emerging Voices and Pathways. And as a PhD candidate at the time, I thought this was a really interesting way and a much less intimidating way to get yourself into the journal game, which can be quite terrifying as a first-time journal author. So the idea is to launch a call for abstracts, which we did, which was fairly structured, and following a shortlisting process, match the author with a mentor. And the mentor is someone who's either familiar with the publishing process. In our case, it was editors were already involved in landscape research, who would walk the authors through the manuscript submission and make sure that they're thinking about journal requirements, thinking about what makes a paper interesting to an audience. And then after the matching to the mentors, a thing that I think is really valuable is to match authors to peers, because writing can be so isolating. And this peer review process is much more generative than the anonymous peer review process, which can be quite brutal at times, where you talk through your papers and respond to each other's papers. So actually in this journal issue, you'll find that you have the paper itself, but you have, followed by the paper, a response from a different author who's written for the special issue, and then a response back. So it's a conversation in addition to the paper, which I think, to me, those have been the most interesting parts of this issue, because some very connections that you wouldn't immediately see between authors begin to arise. And I'll hand over to Paul to talk about the mechanics of some of these things.
Thanks. So yeah, we had our call for papers resulted in over 90 submissions across the globe from 32 countries, and it covered a really wide range of diverse topics, from architecture to agriculture, climate science to environmental humanities, and even to design of to animal geographies. So we've now got 10 papers that have been published online, and as you've heard, will hopefully be available as part of the special issue within the next few days. And it's within issue 5, volume 50, and 4 of these talks that you'll hear are from those 10 papers. So hopefully you'll really enjoy some of this exciting research that we've got for you. I think that's it from me. I'll pass back just to Emma to introduce the first paper.
Thanks very much. I think we've got, I hope this isn't a surprise to you, but I think we've got Nathan first. Hopefully you're ready and good to go, Nathan. We've had a little practice with PowerPoint, so whenever you're ready, do feel free to share your screen and I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, I'm all ready, thanks. Right, can you see just the PowerPoint slide?
It's not shared yet.
Not yet.
It's acting like it is. I'll have a look. Right, that should do it, I imagine. Are we on now?
It's working on it. Yep, there we go.
All right, brilliant then. Let's let this go full screen.
Perfect.
Right, are we up? Yeah, brilliant. Right, first off, thanks for letting me talk today and for all the support that LRG's given me. You know, like you've already said, it's the first time I've had work published. It's the first time I've travelled out of Britain to do research as well. So it's all been quite exciting for me. And, you know, you mentioned the precarious position that, you know, postgrads and postdocs and early career researchers face. So, you know, in 3 years' time, I don't know where I'll be, but I'll definitely know that, you know, writing this paper, I had a really fun time doing it, and I'm really glad I've actually managed to get something published. So this work is part of, this is a smaller aspect of something that I'm hoping to explore more in the future. And that's to document the incorporation of military architecture, symbolism, and motifs in historic garden landscapes. And this can be in the form of planting trees to represent troops, mock forts being built in gardens, even lakes hosting mock naval battles. And the heyday for this sort of thing was, I want to say, like the late 17th and 18th century for England at least. And the reasons for these designs can vary. It can be an attempt to commemoration, could be national pride. It could be the landowner hired someone who had a military background. So, you know, they've got the knowledge to incorporate military architecture onto these landscapes. It could be done to show off. It could be done simply for fun. You know, some of the smaller examples of these mock forts, they literally built them just so the kids had somewhere to play. And for my article, I wanted to look at a unique example in the form of the defence works which surround Birr Castle in Ireland. And this picture, these two pictures that I've got here, this is the front of the defence works. See the castle itself in the second image. And here's a satellite image of Birr Castle, just to help you get a sense of how big the defence works are. The defence works are highlighted in red. And if you've ever seen maps of historic forts, or you know, if you've ever seen pictures of, well, maps of, say, like the Low Countries, like the Netherlands and what have you, you know, the cities there often have these like star-shaped forts designs, and this design here is really trying to weight those designs. Now, this design, it was designed in 1846 to 48, and it was intended as a relief scheme during the Great Famine in Ireland. So they were designed not during some siege or Great War, but instead it was an attempt to keep the local population in work and fed. So, fair enough, that's how people understand them. It was a charity relief scheme, that's fine. But I want to know why take this military design though? You could have took any sort of design to be built around the castle, and they choose this fort design, and I wanted to know why. These sharp angles and whatnot, and particularly at the front of the castle, you could say, well, surely it's just a ha-ha. Now, if you don't really know that sort of terminology, that's essentially a low-cut ditch, essentially, and it acts as like a barrier to animals going into gardens, and people in the gardens can still take in the wider landscape because there's this hidden wall, essentially. But if you look at the history of ha-has, they had a military origin, but by the 19th century, when this design at Burr was made, the military stylization of them, that had all gone. These harsh angles, these flanking points and whatnot. Ha-has had stopped doing that by this point. They were essentially just low rounded walls. So what I wanted to know was, why did Burr adopt this design then? Why did it go back to this military origin when that wasn't the thing that was done anymore? So with the article, there was two main goals. First off was to provide a description of the defence works, describing the site itself, looking at its condition, because no one's ever really took a proper deep dive at the site, and also looking at the archival material which Burr Castle holds concerning its construction. And aside from some really detailed, beautiful plans which are included in the article, there wasn't really a lot of written material concerning its construction as well. And the second goal, like I've already said, it was to consider why this military design was adopted. And that's what I'm going to talk about now. So this military design, these ditches that surround the castle, there's a few different ways that you could interpret them, and I think they all add up, and I think there are a mix of reasons that all blend together. None of them conflict with each other. I think they all informed the design at Burr. And at first, the designs, they parallel with these earlier 18th century examples that I've already talked about. The head of the estate, the Earl of Ross, the third Earl of Ross, he was interested in the sciences and engineering. At the back of the ditch works, he built these workshops where he can, carry out scientific experiments, things like, work with metals, and he also works a lot on fireworks. So he's already interested in sciences and engineering, so incorporating this big design project sort of made sense for him. He was also interested in military engineering. He was an early proponent of ironclad warships, for example, so he sort of ticks that box as this quirky 19th century Victorian gentleman who's really interested in his passions and he isn't afraid to show them off. And another reason, which again is shared with these early 18th century designs, is the co-designer, Richard Waterton Middleton, he was ex-military, so it's likely he had the knowledge to really advise on the shape of the designs. So those two reasons that are really common with these earlier designs. But then we need to also consider Burr Castle's position in Ireland, because all these other earlier examples that I've found, they're all in England, but this instead was in Ireland. And I think with that, we need to consider the Parsons family. They're the ones who owned Burr Castle. Their political position in Ireland, they came over to Ireland as a British settler family. The town that Burr Castle was part of, it was originally called Parsons Town, i.e., they claimed that land, they set up the town, and they were essentially in charge of that region. So with that, I started to examine the history of the town. I looked at newspaper reports, personal communications involving the Parsons family. And it's clear that there was a sense of, in the 19th century, there was always an underlying threat to the family, because, they were in charge of this land. They represented the British Empire, and, people within Ireland wanted to, there were certain factions within Ireland that would like to remove them from power. You know, it could be Irish who wanted a free Ireland. It could be people seeking Catholic emancipation. So there was all these groups in the early 19th century that would have liked to have seen the Parsons family uprooted from power. And it's clear from the Third Lord Ross's letters that he believed that, you know, there was always this underlying threat. So it starts to make you consider, well, these defence works, was it really just to show off, or was there also an element of caution to them? You know, they're a mock fortification compared to real military examples, but were these built in a sense to almost, you know, deter would-be agitators? Because there definitely was some. And, you know, family members related to the Parsons family in other positions around the county, they had been assassinated. So you've got to wonder, well, you know, other than being this showy charity relief scheme, was this design built as an attempt to, you know, deter people who would try to get onto the estate to try and uproot the Parsons family? So, like I said, I'd argue that the works that we see here, this ditch work, it's a really multifaceted thing. You know, it's to show the power of the Parsons family, that, you know, people can't just come onto the estate. But then, you know, it also does function as a way of keeping them safe as well, and also showing off for guests as well. So it's a really multifaceted design, and that was something that during this project I really had to try and get my head around. So that's it. I realise I'm probably going over, so I'll stop there. So thanks for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Nathan. Great opening paper. I think we're going to move through to the next speaker, and then we'll you know, consolidate any questions people have right at the end, as Zana said. So we're going to move on to Frederik now, if you don't mind loading up your PowerPoint. Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'll hand it straight over to you.
Where's the unmute button? I think, is it in there? No. You get the slides now?
Not as a slide. Oh, yeah, yep, here it is. Good one.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for this opportunity to introduce my paper. I'm just going to delve right in. So in the adult world's attempt to address the spiraling sustainability crisis in relation to the rest of nature, both high hopes and promises are often attached to young people. And yet, young people today have very limited possibilities to shape even their own living environments, not to mention the future of a globalized world. I'll start with a small vignette presenting my first encounter, also my baby steps into my PhD research that came to influence the full 5 years I ended up working on it, and then give a few words of context and present some key empirical details. But first, this vignette. It's also in the article. There is a near total silence among the young people in the meeting room as I write, "Sustainable urban landscapes of the future, according to young people in Malmö," on a long piece of paper stuck to the wall. As the rustling of the pen over the paper settles, the brief glances from the young people quickly turn down towards phone screens or disappear inside the hoods of jackets. Despite substantial encouragement and insistence that the content of the project is also for them to define, the young participants seem reluctant to engage. When prodded, one asks, "Landscape what?" and another declares she is tired of sustainability, as she's been part of sustainability-related project before and it had not seemed relevant to her at all and she got nothing out of it. There was a sense of the young people both not wanting to be in this room, and yet they were there. They clearly felt ambivalent or downright negative about the title I provided. The article I wrote describes this process with the young participants that tried to delve into what was entailed in this initial rejection of the prompt I gave and what we could learn about their relation to landscape from there. So landscape has increasingly been worked into urban policy and planning in ways that highlight greenery and benefits of functioning and diverse ecosystems. Concepts like blue-green infrastructure, ecosystem services, nature-based solutions are increasingly prevalent and can shape urban planning processes. Meanwhile, the landscape has also been highlighted as an inherently democratic entity that should be understood from professional practice as well as the diverse perspectives of lay citizens as they experience their daily environments. And critical scholars warn of trends like green gentrification in the urban scene, where greening can actually exacerbate urban inequality through greening measures, and risks catering mainly to interest of affluent populations. So to work with young people in this sort of very, very broadly conceived realm, I've drawn primarily on an approach derived from something called critical utopian action research and some framework understandings from the literature and landscape democracy. A few key terms that have shaped the work is the notion of critique, which brings a heightened attention to material and discursive power, and the notion of utopia, which encourages us to look beyond what currently exists. Utopia is also, in the word of one of its important theorists, an island that arises in that you start to move towards it, and that it really emphasizes the importance of concrete action to make that word meaningful. These dimensions aim to facilitate a sort of free space where the structuring power of contemporary society is temporarily paused in order to reflect on and pursue new ideas about how we want to live. So I've conducted my research in the city of Malmö, and the city of Malmö in southern Sweden have worked conscientiously with greening and sustainability, and landscape perspectives are increasingly present in land use decisions and priorities in the form of, for example, green infrastructure, or conservation, or climate adaptation. Meanwhile, Malmö is a young and diverse city and home to relatively steep socioeconomic divides between more or less affluent areas. And questions remain whether the new approaches and solutions are to the benefit of all of its diverse population. So in practical terms, I've engaged with 34 young people aged 15 to 20, hailing primarily from 2 different neighborhoods in Malmö that in municipal statistics and public discourse appears as low income or socioeconomically vulnerable. And in a series of future creation workshops, we've gone through critical, utopian, and action-oriented phases. So getting back to where this vignette dropped off, when the participants eventually found enough encouragement to pitch in, the first critical response was that it was impossible to change anything in their living environments. This was extensively discussed, and eventually the young participants decided it was important to, firstly, talk about segregation, and why growing up in some areas seemed so different and harder than in others. Gradually, Project Society, as the young people came to call it, took form, and by inserting the questions about landscape and sustainability into this sort of encompassing frame, they found ways to articulate complex relationships to their streets, squares, school, and inner yards, and even to the local go-kart center in the huge industrial complex in one of the neighborhoods. The fact that they had never been inside this go-kart center was a recurring discussion point. The key critiques that the young people sort of were gathering around when they discussed many months their understandings of their local living environments was, I'm quoting from their writing here, getting judged by your background and not who you are, and unequal standards of urban living environments. However, continuously throughout the years, the workshop space broke down and was mired in discussions about how prejudice was also experienced as differentiated among them. After one such chaotic meeting with discussions and splits within the group, the researchers and young people walked to a nearby Burger King where the young people had requested if we could have a workshop dinner, as we had for all meetings that spanned both afternoon and evening. The researcher suddenly found the young people laughing and joking about something that someone who had talked about having mech'd the school to get time off. None of the researchers understood what it was to mech something, but the young people explained how it meant to turn something that seemed adversary or working against you to your advantage. At the next meeting, the word came up again, and to the young people's collective joy, one participant loudly explained that he was going to mech the municipality for everyone, and get the money for the concrete change ideas that arose during the utopian phases of the workshops. The metaphor gathered the young people around perspectives that they at times forgot that they shared, and furthermore gave them a joyful boost of confidence that diminished the uncertainty they felt about contacting local authorities. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to detail all the sort of things that transpired since, and the paper is mainly about how this initial rejection of the premise I provided shaped the research. I can just note for now that, for example, the shared metaphor, through that the young people developed a strong and unique urban landscape perspective. It just needed to also be about the specter of the go-kart center, about the feelings of prejudice and unsafety, and about exploring the freedom to be oneself and find joy. In this way, it eventually became clear that the very streets, squares, and parks and inner yards that are currently entering municipal planning visions full of potential to green and to climate adapt and to possibly hike housing taxes, and also are also of keen interest to their young inhabitants and their visions for the future, even if it might not always sound like that to the adult practitioners engaging in the first place. I think this sort of the article and the delving into this first data point of sorts really provides some initial pointers for engagement platforms that can allow groups like young citizens to play a more active role in shaping their future living environments. And it provides a chance for meaningful engagement with other kinds of more adult-driven landscape expertise and practice on young people's terms. And finally, I just wanted to say a big word of thanks to the editors, mentor, and author, and everyone practically involved in this publication process. With developing and publishing this paper. I've really experienced this care focus that you tried to emphasize also, Emma, and have experienced this process as extremely supportive and nourishing and refreshing in the world of academic publishing that I'm only just getting to know. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Just enough information in there for everyone to not only want to dash off and read your paper, but also follow where the work takes you next. So brilliant. Thank you very much for that. We'll hand straight over to Elza now, if you want to queue up your PowerPoint.
Yes, thank you, Emma. I hope I'm audible.
The sound's a little from my end. It's a little difficult. I don't know if everyone else is having that.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I have some planes going on. We are near the airport. I'm sharing my screen now.
Great. That is, audio is perfect now. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Like Frederik before me, I would like to thank LRG and the editors and everyone, the mentors, the peers, everyone who was behind this issue and the care and support that was given us. So I'm presenting to you, my name is Elza, and I'm presenting to you from Bangalore, or Bengaluru as it's now called, in southern India. What you see on my screen are three images. One is of the kind of urban agriculture I'm talking about. My paper itself is about an intersection of urban planning and urban agriculture and historical period of 1950s to 1970s. And the second image, what you'll see is a planning map where you can see that there are some blues, greens, yellows. So what you see now as blues is an ecological terrain of water bodies, runoff water bodies, man-made water tanks. And what is missing in this picture is the kind of urban agricultural patches, which were called tota or market gardens, as we can call them now. And the people, as you can see the picture from 1960s that you can see here, and the people who are behind those totas, that is actually what is missing when you look at Bangalore or the future of Bangalore, or when people talk about the future. Bangalore is a metropolitan city now. Okay, so what you can see instead are all these remnants of agricultural tanks. This is a step well, a well in which people would step and take water from. And these kind of water bodies and which are now repurposed for other uses are still present, like the infrastructure of the past, which is present next to high-rise buildings and residential complexes. What is missing, like I was talking to you about, is a group of market gardens, which was there next to these water bodies. The first picture is from 1960s, where this was very evident. And the second picture now I have taken from peri-urban Bangalore. Bangalore is now 750 square kilometers, and this is outside of those limits. Whereas the first picture was about in 15-kilometer radius from Bangalore center in the 1960s. So there is a kind of conflict between what the market gardeners, whom I'll be talking to in a bit, think about, and what the planners think about as Bangalore. What exactly is relevant to the society now is something that is under discussion. So when we talk about urban planning, Bangalore is a formerly colonized place. So there is a lot of eminent research on how the governance itself is imbued in colonial practices which have evolved now to take up capitalist requirements. I have here two planning maps, one from 1954 and the 1968. The reason I've chosen this period is because India got its independence in 1947, and planning as an independent entity actually developed with Indian hands only after that. So in these first attempts, I wanted to look at what was being done and what was on ground. Now, I will not get what was on ground from these maps. What instead I get is that there are a lot of green patches, and between the two maps, there's a lot of reduction in those green patches. And the planning document itself says that in 1968, only 5% of the area of the land, which was 500 square kilometers at that time, I mean, the planning area, was under urban agriculture, and the scrub lands outside the peri-urban lands, which were taken up for new cultivation. This was from a proposal called the Green Belt, where the city itself was enclosed, was encircled by green belts. But the problem with the green belt is that as the city grew and the planning area grew, the green belt kept shifting, and the place for agriculture also kept shifting. So what was missing here is a kind of lived experience, especially the unequal lived experience, that I wanted to look at in order to complete a picture or a story of this. So for that, I contacted a group of, traditionally, they're known as the market gardeners of Bangalore, as in urban lore in Bangalore. But they don't practice this in Bangalore, the inner 750 square kilometers as such right now. So I had to go look for them in the peri-urban. But there are a lot of documents which talk about their connection with the Bangalore terrain, how they celebrate festivals of water in Bangalore, etc. So when I was talking to them, something that came up was that there was a conflict between the state and these group of people in the 1960s, where a state department of horticulture came in support of them in order to protect their market gardens in the inner city from development, planned development in the 1954 plan, which it was to be taken up for a residential purpose. But they got the attention of the national ministers to prevent this. And the 1968 plan also shows that this patch was left it was left without the kind of development that was planned. So what happens now in 2022, when I took this picture, this is what that place looks like. And what you see next to it is where another locality, which is also of market gardens nearby, is completely built up. And this was due to because the people themselves, the market gardeners themselves, feared that their land would be taken up and they would not be paid any money in order to live. So they themselves sold off the land. So these were two processes that I found. The third process is that the gardens were taken up and these people were not given any other skills to become part of Bangalore. So they become unskilled laborers. And that one of the reasons now they are called backward castes, because they had small holdings to begin with, and secondly, when their lands were taken up for the development of Bangalore, they were not given compensation enough to take up lands elsewhere. So what I found in the peri-urban is that many of these Vanicka Kshatriyas, as they are called, although they have taken up, some of them have taken up market gardens, their practices have changed. But what distinguishes them from other urban agricultural practice of the present is that they don't have any hydroponics or any other kind of food production. They only care for, their practice is very linked to the soil with a lot of practices, traditional practices. So we can say that a lot of care for land and soil remains, and the loss of land remains a kind of point of friction between the Vanicka Kshatriyas and the state. So what I would like to point out now is that in my paper, especially after what I was looking at, from the narratives that I've heard and also from analyzing the documents, is that the urban agriculture, in this sense, even though it was culturally relevant and was pointed out in the planning documents that it is culturally relevant, this was left to a kind of as in, there was no protection given to these kind of landscapes, even though it is socially, economically, and relevant for the sustenance of the people, as well as for culturally relevant to the group of people I'm talking about itself. This was considered unskilled. It could be replicated anywhere. There was no concern for the terrain as such, because this practice of these people are linked with the terrain itself, the flow of land, the flow of water, the slope of land, the kind of soils, etc. This is traditional knowledge that they have had. But all of these are not, they're not reflected in any kind of planning documents. And there is something that we have to think about even when urban planning talks about giving space for urban agriculture. There's always, I mean, especially in a formerly colonized place, it is a very conflicted outlook that has been there. So with that, I would like to stop my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll move on to our final speaker before we can then move into discussion. So Koenraad, would you like to load up your PowerPoint, and I'll mute and hand over to you.
Yeah, can you see my my slides? Perfect. Wait, now I have to see my slides. Yeah. Okay, so thanks so much, and also thanks from me for this whole process and bringing this special issue together. So I'm Koenraad Danneels. Just to quickly introduce myself, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the KU Leuven and University of Antwerp. And so I'll present today the paper, which is called Compensation Landscapes. That was part of this special issue. So before I start, I want to highlight that I see this paper as a sort of agenda setting paper. With it, I try to argue that we need to study ecological compensation or biodiversity offsetting through the spaces that such policies produce, which I call the compensation landscapes. Now, maybe a quick heads up. What is interesting is that after this paper was published, I actually got funding to study this idea of compensation landscapes further in Europe. So I'm currently doing more field work on these topics, which I will also share with you, a bit of which I will share with you today. So I want to start my presentation. I also started the paper with a personal story. So in the winter of 2020, during the COVID outbreak, I discovered the Overmeerspark, which you can see here, nearby the central train station of my hometown, Ghent. And this wildlife area lies in the outskirts of the city between some road infrastructure and a canal and a residential neighborhood. And when I visited it, an information plate on site communicated that this was a compensation park. So realizing its genesis, I wondered, what is a compensation park? What did it compensate for? And how was it designed as compensation? And so the park itself is a compensation area for roadworks, as it was protected under a Belgian Nature Conservation Act, which said that any valuable areas should be protected. You can see the park in green next to the sort of orangey road. So the orange, the road in orange that you can see was built through the nature reserve. And so actually half of the remaining nature was then protected as compensation for the roadworks. And so the construction destroyed some of the existing green spaces that were seen as biologically valuable. And the leftover space was used to compensate for that development process. So in the maps produced, which you can see here, by planners, we can see how the numbers of trees cut and planted are calculated and which paths were constructed to make the park also accessible for walking and cycling. Also, some groundworks made it more interesting for wildlife. But when visiting this park, a strange feeling came upon me. Did human accessibility of the park actually increase the biodiversity, which was the ultimate goal? And can this park, which is cut in half by the roadworks, capture the lost habitat of the part that was cut out? And is this really also an optimal place to build a park? So the idea behind this compensation of nature or biodiversity offsetting is that through ecosystem restoration, important ecosystem functions that have been destroyed through urban development are replaced elsewhere. And this is sort of policy that is popping up everywhere in Europe, in the European Union, but also in the UK with biodiversity net gain policies. And literature on biodiversity offsetting has often centered on the development, but also the critique of this policy framework. But it often, I think, and with me, for example, also Rebecca Leuven and Martin Doyle, it often bypasses the territories and landscapes that are actually produced by these policies. So therefore, I think we should start analyzing these landscapes to understand the sort of project that compensation constitutes. So the sort of key claims of the paper, but also my current research, is that the landscape of compensation is ignored, but also the designers who are designing these landscapes are also ignoring the political and economic processes that made their design possible. And so it's also linked to landscape architecture. And so I look actually at three different, I think that landscape research can help in understanding this project to three scopes. One is to understand compensation landscapes as tools of negotiation. The other one is by understanding the geographies of compensation, and lastly, by looking at how compensation landscapes are designed. And I will quickly run through some elements that I also discuss in the paper. So this is a map made by a student, a master student of mine in the Master of Urbanism in Ghent, who studied forest compensation in Flanders. What is interesting about forest compensation in Flanders is that while it's a policy that is widespread, so any forest that is cut down has to be compensated for, but actually the government doesn't map this. So we, for the first time, mapped forest compensation. What we saw is that it's really sort of not that there is no reflection on the territoriality of this compensation. And so this is an example of one resort that was built on a forest. You can see that anywhere in Flanders, which is a region in Belgium, that these forests, compensation forests, are spread out, really not linked to the original forest that was cut down. But when looking more deeply into this case, what is interesting is that actually these locations are all, these compensation forests are all located close to nature reserves that are managed by a nature conservation agency that actually brokered the deal on these compensation areas. So that brings me to this idea of compensation and compensation landscapes as tools of negotiation. And I'm actually just back from a 3-month research stay in Berlin, where I was, for example, studying the Gleisdreieck Park, which is a compensation for the nearby Potsdamer Platz Park. Potsdamer Platz development, which most of you probably will know. And so what is interesting there is that this Gleisdreieck Park was really sort of negotiation between nature conservation agencies, the city of Berlin itself, but also the developers of Potsdamer Platz, who had to compensate for their environmental impact. But when looking closely at the spaces produced, actually these compensation landscapes themselves are also subject to negotiation, in the sense that the developers also want to use the outskirts of this park, and these are sort of two propositions, to build houses, because actually building houses close to these compensation parks, of course, creates more high value real estate. So while you would think that compensation landscapes are protected landscapes, actually they are urban projects in themselves. And so I think that's really interesting to look at how these negotiations play out. And then the last focus I have is that of the design of compensation landscapes. So a question that I still didn't answer fully, I think, is how these sort of biodiversity metrics and this whole calculative system actually influences design. For example, as in the last slide, this is a biodiversity metric implemented by Natural England in the UK. But also, I'm studying parks, for example, in Berlin, this Landschaftspark, which is actually compensation for roadworks. that lead towards an airport. And the designer of this landscape park argued that the park is really great. However, the designer also mentions that the question remains if the design is not actually covering up the sort of she calls it an ecological sin, if the design is not covering up that sin. So I finish my paper with a return to the Overmeerspark. So after my visit, I looked at photographs of what the area looked like actually before it became a compensation park. And what is quite strange is that if you look at these pictures, you see it was actually already quite green and it was already quite biodiverse. So if compensation has so little effect on landscapes, what is to be made of it? The answer, I think, lies not only in what has been preserved and designed, but even more so in what has been lost. Overmeerspark does not just function as a substitute, but also as an alibi for ecological erasure, which makes it much more problematic. So the whole area, both the parts destroyed and the park itself that functions as its compensation, has, so I argue, been drawn into the circuits of planning negotiations and have been opened up for conventional urban use. So rather than a tool for nature conservation, compensation is, I think, an urbanization project, one that we should study through landscape research to understand whose agendas it actually serves and what consequences it has. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fantastic final paper. We can now, I guess, move into the next sort of phase of this Zoom, which is to open things up to discussion. I'm kind of looking to Zano in terms of time. I can see we're nearly at 10. So do you want us to work through the prepared questions or open things straight up to the audience in case they have questions?
I don't see any questions in the chat yet. So maybe if you do like one or two of the prepared questions, and then this is a good reminder for people. If you do have questions, but I was just about to type it, but put them in the chat, type them in the chat, or you can, I think, maybe use the raise hand function or type in the chat that you have a question if you want to unmute and ask it. Again, I think preferences for questions that go across all papers because that often leads to better discussion. But if you do have a more specific question, you're welcome to ask it. But Emma, yeah, if you want to dive into a couple of those prepared questions.
Well, we wanted to start with, you know, nothing critical, just a nice, let's just hear a little bit more about you and your thinking. So the first question is really just to ask you, each of you, to tell us a little bit about the key thinkers or writers who, in particular, you know, key thinkers who've inspired your work, sort of underpin your approach to the projects you've just told us about. I don't know if you want to just go in the same order that you just did, or if you want to just, one of you wants to start talking. Either is fine.
Okay, we'll just go in the order that we started with then. So for me, there's a few different avenues for like key writers, because there's, like I mentioned, like a lot of the study of these militarized landscapes, these garden landscapes, it all comes from like 18th century. So a lot of historians who have looked at the 18th century and these militarized gardens, particularly John Dixon Hunt, should say that a lot of the writers, they often write one article on this and it's done. No one's really explored it proper yet, and I don't know if that means it's my job to do that or whatever. I don't know. Chandra Mukherjee, she looked at the gardens of Versailles, and she really looks at how incorporating military architecture in gardens, it's sort of like to project power, but obviously that's in France, so it's a bit different. Lastly, Finola O'Kane as well. She looks at Irish landscapes and also across the Atlantic as well in America, and she also looks at this idea of how landscapes can sort of like reflect the climate at the time, be it a revolutionary climate or a climate that's trying to, you know, maintain its position and power in the landscape. And lastly, a book came out while I was writing the article, and I was like, I wish I'd known about it at the time, but I'd already finished. G.A. Bremner and Daniel Maudlin, Inner Empire, because they focus on these landscapes, but rather than looking at, you know, colonial landscapes in Britain's colonial holdings across the Atlantic and where else have you, they look at the Inner Empire. So they're actually looking at these landscapes in England, in Ireland, you know, in the UK, which is not really been looked at yet. So yeah.
Oh, sounds super interesting. And also what I'm hearing you're the key voice in this space. There's plenty of space for you to delve further into this. Frederik, do you want to chip in?
Sure. It's a bit of a hard question because also being a very, very junior researcher, everything you think and talk about comes from other places. But I think I'm actually really appreciating the question because a lot of my work is very driven by and focused on sort of my own background in activism and volunteering and being very practically engaged in these things that I'm also now doing research on. But I really also feel so much of the value comes from some of the wider theoretical and even philosophical strains in it, like I quoted Ernst Bloch in the beginning of the presentation, but also thinkers like Adorno and others who really emphasize this sort of the moment of doubt in creating knowledge and hesitation and like delving into the ambivalences instead of like asserting knowledge claims. And I really feel like just this dynamic movement between discussing something in the everyday lives of these young people and these sort of more philosophical approaches really gives a lot of very productive tension, and just the whole like emphasis and insistence on utopia as something we can work with, something that helps us transgress a little bit the patterns we fall into in research, just as in any other sort of field of practice, have been very influential. So maybe if I am to just highlight a little bit, that would be it.
Brilliant, thank you. Elza, how about you?
Yeah, thank you, Emma. And I would like to say that I'm looking at now 2-3 different trajectories that merge. I mean, it was never a single thought that came up. In terms of decolonization of urban planning, I would say that Nihal Pereira, and even while I was writing the paper, I was introduced to Yasmina Bibijan, all of those people. Now, when I read it, I felt, yes, this is what I was thinking about, but I never knew about, as in someone had about it. This was not my PhD, this was after my PhD. Some stories that I heard led me into this research. Secondly, I would say that Anuradha Mathur and Dilip Dakunya, who have a wonderful book on Bangalore, Bangalore Deccan Traverses, that was a very big influence for not only me, for many people who research on Bangalore. And third, I would say that my PhD supervisor, Indra Chaudhary, who was an oral historian, who got me listening to people. That would be my 3 influences that I would think.
Fantastic, thank you. Koenraad.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Great to think what are the sort of main inspirations. Yeah, I can name a few. One of them is a researcher, a professor in the US, Ross Exo Adams, who's in theory and history of architecture, who wrote his book Circulation and Urbanization. And he did a lot of work on this idea of ecological urbanization and what it means, ecological urbanization. And in one of the texts that I read of him, he explained that that now something strange is happening, that to naturalize, we should urbanize. This is something that he said somewhere. So, and he comes to this proposition through theory. And my work, I think, is like trying to find the sort of empirical material that also supports that theory or contradicts it. So I think his work is really foundational for me. And then, yeah, the paper itself came actually about when I was doing a research stay at the University of Cambridge in the UK with Matthew Gandhi. And so he has always been a big inspiration for my work, also my previous work. Also, Sandra Jasper, who also worked with him, they both actually launched this concept of compensation landscapes. And so I picked up on it. They only very briefly discuss it. And so I really found that it's something worth extending upon. And then in terms of like empirical work that has been done, I think there's one great book called Greening Berlin by Jens Lachmuth, who is an STS researcher and who was one of the first studying urban ecology as a knowledge system, but also as with political consequence, with also as a political system. And in one of the chapters in his book Greening Berlin, he really talks about mitigation and how ecology influences planning processes. And so that was really also sort of an eye-opener for me for how important this idea of compensation has become nowadays. But his research really goes up to the 90s and stops there. And so I also pick it up somewhere. So my studies on Berlin start from his work, you could say, and then go further. And then maybe a last one, if I still have time, is Elia Apostolopoulou, which was also a UK researcher and who did amazing work on this idea of biodiversity offsetting and really critiquing its consequences. So that was also a major inspiration.
We've got a couple of follow-up questions, just people are keen to hear. Could you write the name of the professor? I think it's the first, Kath, correct me if I'm wrong, is the first inspiration you spoke about, and then Frederik asks what the Berlin book was called that you mentioned. So maybe if you have a moment,
I will write it down.
One of those. I'm going to hand over to, I think, Paul now, who has a question for each of you.
Yes, thanks. I've got a question about power and governance for you. So you each talk about the differentials in power and the politics of landscapes and its governance. We wondered, can you reflect on how you have chosen to explore concerns of power and governance in your context and why? And if, again, we could go through in the same order that you had your presentations. So Nathan, could you lead on that question?
Yeah, so I think for me, power's a weird one for me in mine, because obviously like there's the idea that the family were like, you know, for many in Ireland, they were like occupying their land. So there was that sense, but then, you know, there was also the sense of the fact that they built this like impressive structure, and it wasn't just meant to be power as like an oppressive tool, but it was power as like an artistic tool, because like I said, the original plans, they were meant to be a lot less militarized in a way. Like it was meant to have these big flower beds on them, so it was also meant to be, they've got the power and the wealth to not just create, you know, these impressive military structures, but within that like actual artistic structures as well. And then there was also like the side of it that the family, you know, they had the tools and the manpower to, you know, not just build these things, but actually organize a charitable event as well, because ultimately like the defense works were designed as like an attempt to famine relief. So power in that context was weird, because it wasn't just necessarily built in terms of, you know, like keeping unwanted actors out of the estate. It was also an attempt to, you know, try and unify and solidify the local area. So it's quite a murky one for me in terms of power. And you know, this idea of it was trying to unify the local population. I should say the family still live there. So, you know, after, you know, you get into the early 20th century and many Irish landowners, you know, they have to leave or their estates are burned down, that the family remain there. And in some sense, it's due to you know, these charitable efforts that they do at the same time. They sort of made them as landowners probably a bit more safer when the time came that many English landowners had to leave. Like instead, they sort of managed to maintain a positive relation there. So it's a weird one for me looking at the power angle of it, I think. Yeah, hope that helps a little bit. I don't know.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it hints at that context and the importance. Yeah. So Frederik, over to you.
Yeah, I guess for me it's kind of a starting premise in a way, and rather than talking more about critical theory and stuff, I just also wanted to emphasize how the focus is also a little bit life story based. Growing up in the outskirts of Copenhagen, which is, I don't know, maybe not somewhere you would immediately think of as riven with power divides and so on, but still having grown up in like a middle class, pretty affluent villa neighborhood, and having classmates from just across the road in big social housing blocks, and then experiencing how different life circumstances, outlooks on things were, but also the path to getting heard, being acknowledged, seeing what kind of perspective on everyday life that is constantly being catered to by the society around, just means that I don't think I could ever do an analysis that wasn't somehow influenced by that. I think it really, I think that's also why the young people I've been working with, they stayed in the room after me coming and presenting a very almost moronic premise to them that they didn't like, is because we agreed that there was something amiss on who gets a say in envisioning increasingly popular and prevalent trends in urban policy and discourse. And I really think when I discovered this whole landscape democracy authorship, I was so excited because I felt like there was a very good way to connect a lot of the everyday life concerns I had with me and my friends and the kind of volunteering I engaged in and so on, with some of the very pressing matters for, you know, our world and society right now. Yeah, maybe I just stop there.
Yeah, thank you. Interesting. Same question to Elza.
So as you know, 1950s to 1970s is a very specific period, especially for a lot of newly independent countries. It was a period of hope and a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of nationalistic planning. And so what I was looking at is, with this energy and with this ethos of hope, what was going on ground in the cities that were there. I mean, a lot of people coming from the rural areas to the city, and then there's a demand for housing, and what was happening to the ecological, because nobody actually, I mean, in planning itself, nobody was concerned about those. But what was interesting was that in 1954, they acknowledged that this was a relevant practice, and then it was eroded. So that is the first element of power that I was looking at. The second is that there is a lot of, like I was talking about earlier, there's a lot of unequal lived experiences that are there in the practitioners of market gardening and the planners who were doing something for the entire society cross-section. So those two aspects of power is what I was reflecting upon, as planning itself. We are trying to decolonize planning. How do we bring back voices of people into, even with participatory processes? Even recent research has shown that when their own house and their own land is under planning view, then everybody distrusts the government. So that is something that I was looking at as well. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. And finally, Koenraad.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So for me, power is really important. So as I mentioned in my presentation, I realized that compensation, or this idea of biodiversity offsetting, is often not territorially reflected by governments. Now, if it's not reflected by them, it is influenced by others, so by power play by other actors. And what is really interesting now that I'm finding in my research is that actually nature conservation movements or nature conservation groups are often becoming ever more important in this sort of question of where does compensation happen? And so for me, this question of power links up to who decides what happens where, and that's, I think, also a major issue here, like who wins and who loses when nature is destroyed in one place and is being replaced somewhere else. And so where is it replaced? Which real estate? Often real estate development wins actually through these sort of interactions. But the sort of problem I see is that these nature conservation movements, they become very important in negotiating where all of this happens, but so they become also very dependent on these sort of new policies. And so while they seem more powerful in the negotiation, actually they become maybe less powerful in, for example, criticizing urbanization processes. Yeah, maybe a complex answer, but yeah, power is really important there.
Thanks. Some great responses there, and I think what really strikes is the range of responses that we've had from each of the four talkers. So thank you. So I think I'll pass over to Vanicka, who's also got a question for you.
Thanks, Paul. Actually, the question that I had is very similar to the question that Amrita has popped into the chat, which is just a happy coincidence, or all of us are lacking in creativity. I don't know which one it is, but I think it's striking across the four papers, which seem quite different in positioning and historicizing, but the historical thread that each of you have in your work, it's obviously more evident in Nathan's work than it might be in Frederik's work, but there is the use of an archive. And each of you is using different kinds of archives, but equally, I noticed in the presentations more than the papers actually that you're using the landscape as your primary archive, and reading the landscape as not just the landscape itself, but as evidence of various historical political processes. So maybe for our audience, you could tell us a bit about the methods that you're thinking about, how you're doing this, what's prompting you to look at the landscape in specific ways, and how you're joining it to literal historical archives, but also the archive of qualitative research. So we'll go back to Nathan and then Frederik.
So I think why I took this approach, looking at the defence works from like a historical perspective, I mean, first and foremost, like that is just one small aspect of the Burgcastle estates. Like there's all these, it's really the most minor thing compared to everything else, because they've got all these different pieces of like architecture. They've got all these trees from far away places. They've got all these different architectural features like grottos made out of shells and what have you. So it was, you know, on its own, it just looks like a standard architectural feature that, you know, like signifies this is where all the parks end and this is where the castle starts. And I think it was only through looking at it from a historical perspective that we really understood the actual nature of that architectural feature. And I think that's the case for everything though, isn't it? Like, I mean, all landscapes are shaped by the history, you know, especially at landscape parks where you think, you know, everything's designed to look natural when that's actually not the case. You know, originally there might have been a forest where, you know, this big rolling grassy field is, you know, this lake might not have originally been there. So I think it's always important, I think, to really look at like the history. And in my case, it was a case of diving into the archive, and then when the archive was starting to run dry for answers, it's looking at not just the landscape, but the landscape even beyond that. You know, what were the tensions at the time? What were people thinking that might have informed this design? Does that help at all? Or do you want me to expand?
It does, absolutely. And the beautiful maps that you used in your paper definitely help clarify lots of points. Over to you, Frederik.
Yes, I'm also very thankful for the question, because it actually touches upon a little bit of a sort of dream project of mine, which is to do a more sort of historical synthesis with the young people I work with that is sort of guided by their lines of questioning, the kind of approaches that opens up the landscape for them. But it's also one of the extremely taxing things about action research, and it can be hard to jam into a PhD period that's already smack full of all sorts of other ambitions. But I have a sketch somewhere in my computer for this sort of history workshop that is just tries to tell the story of Malmö, of their living environment, from the sort of guiding points that they give, which is maybe something about a history of combating racism and prejudice, history of trying to gain influence when the fact is inequality, and find a way to make a synthesis from their experiences into this wider historical arch. But it's unfortunately something I haven't come around to yet, because it's already a lot doing this extensive field work and trying to write a PhD. But I really feel your question has inspired me to pick it up and try and raise it with the young participants in my workshops. And I think it would have immense value. And also just I just totally float away when hearing you talk, Nathan, into these like longer historical arches that I think add so much value.
That's fascinating, Frederik, because the oral history from below usually also ends up excluding young people because they're not thought to be sources of longer history. So I think that's a really interesting method to explore. Over to you, Elza.
Okay, I mean, connecting with what Frederik was and Nathan was talking about, being the landscape or the people as the archive. So I was looking at a lost landscape, as in, for me, the planning documents was not the archive I went to first. The people, I mean, I was talking to people and I was walking through those landscapes with those people, and they were pointing me to places that were before. So these who don't get archived anywhere. I mean, as in what we have access to are the important histories like that people would look at. I mean, everyday lives of people don't get archived as such. And after maybe 10 years, because the people I'm talking about are in their 80s, 90s. So after a few years, they will be lost. So the landscape itself, even the lost landscapes, do hold memories. And again, only by looking at what is in people's everyday commute and what is there, even small markers of like what I was talking about, the loss, the infrastructure, which was of a previous thing, which kind, and which was repurposed, and the stories about it, which all point to looking at the physical archive for what actually happened. I mean, that is a good, I mean, that gives a very richer understanding of what is not there in the archive itself, the absence itself, like what people talk about the archive, and oral histories themselves. I mean, sometimes there are intergenerational histories. When I was doing my oral history project, I mean, there would be different generations would be sitting together and they would be discussing. And I mean, it was not like a one-to-one conversation also. People would be talking about different memories. Grandfathers or grandmothers would be talking to their grandchildren about, okay, you remember this. And I mean, it is a community history, basically. So, I mean, I would think that the archive itself is the landscape and the people who inhabit it itself. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Vanicka, for that question.
Thanks, Elza. And I think sort of taking the planning documents not necessarily as gospel truth is probably the wisest thing to do in a South Asian context. Over to you, Koenraad.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, it's really an important question for me as well, because I'm actually educated as a historian and my previous work was mainly historical. So, but this question of landscape as an archive is interesting. In my work, landscape is both the place where compensation is negotiated in, but it's also the tool for negotiation. And so that makes landscape sort of interesting concept, as it's a sort of tool that's been negotiated, but in the landscape itself, design then, I claim, negotiates, for example, access, openness or closeness for certain people or certain groups. So in that sense, yeah, the analysis of the landscape as an archive is really important to understand that negotiation. But for me also, starting this project, history was really important, because I felt that the geographical literature on, for example, biodiversity offsetting, this whole literature on neoliberal nature conservation lacked for me a bit of historical perspective. As I have the feeling that planning history is sort of, from the moment that we start to understand biodiversity offsetting as negotiating urbanization, we can also see that it has a sort of longer trajectory in planning history. So planning history is for me really important here to understand urbanization processes. And also maybe to add to that sort of historical perspective also now makes me, for example, in my analysis of Berlin, look at what changes in these policies and how then landscapes are negotiated. You often see that, for example, the 1990s are very different from the years 2000 and years 2010 until now. And so I try to, like, it's very close history, but still I think we can already perceive the 90s, for example, as a historical period. And understanding that historical period and how it's very different from today is really interesting to understand these processes of naturalization and urbanization.
Absolutely. And I particularly liked how you talked about the real estate and the compensation negotiation, because that wasn't something I'd deeply considered before. And the historicizing of that in the 90s is definitely pertinent to particularly what you're looking at. Do we have questions from the audience now? Otherwise, I have a question that maybe could round us off for today.
If anybody wants to speak up in the audience and like unmute
it.
and ask a question, go for it. Yeah. Amrita had more of a comment, and Vanicka, I think it's great how your question came into that. But if anybody else has any questions.
I've got a question for Frederik, if
Go
no
for it.
audience.
Oh yeah, I love that.
Yeah, so like this, because I've taught like sustainability to like, you know, like teens and first level undergraduates, and like, so from what I understand, this mech is like getting something out of something. I think you word it as like, is that the issue with trying to teach sustainability sometimes? Because obviously like, we do need to be so much more sustainable like as countries and individuals, but does it always boil down to like we need something from it other than the fact of just being sustainable for the sake of it? Because to me there always needs to be this incentive to doing it, which is really depressing, but you know that always seems to be the case, at least from my instance of, you know, teaching these sort of things.
Oh, that is such a wonderful question, Nathan, and it's probably something we could talk about for the next 2 weeks. But I think the immediate place my mind goes is that the reason why this idea to mech becomes super important in talking about sustainability with this particular group of young people is when the fact is inequality. Then this idea, the idea to mech that the young people have gathered around and they've used to actually launch their projects have been a way to highlight how right now a well-meaning, reasonably democratically organized, in some ways, city like Malmö still builds sustainability for a very certain demographic, for a very certain outlook to life that's not these young people, or maybe a few of them. Like it was also like you never have a completely homogeneous group, right? But for a lot of them, it wasn't. And even for the ones who were like on their path to education and youth jobs and stuff, they recognized that the life that is being built, envisioned, furthered, and tried to be made more sustainable in Malmö. Like you have the big harborfront districts where they've just had to build another gigantic parking house with green walls and roofs because so many people there have 2 cars and a single family. And it's not that these things are inherently, well, maybe that is inherently wrong, I don't know, but it's just that the kind of challenges that the municipality, lots of practitioners, the market actors, everyone are trying to solve with the headline of sustainability and greening the urban landscape and things like that are not the problems of these young people. And that's why they become so resistant to it. And I really feel as much as it dislodged something for them to start to talk about making the municipality, it really taught me something that I hope to like pass on about when sustainability is also differentiated. And I think it just becomes extremely painfully aware in a city like Malmö that wins tons of awards, ranks high in all sorts of sustainability metrics for projects that are for a much more affluent demographic than the young people that I work with, and that I guess in some sort of basic material sense actually don't consume as much and don't have as big a footprint on life in the world. And it really sort of unmasks the discursive power in that whole field, I feel. And yeah, then the reason the discussion could go on for 2 weeks is that because then of course we come back to, but what is the good sustainable urban landscape and stuff? And no, maybe it's not getting something more out of something, but this path into it is also relevant if we want it to be more inclusive and not just sort of a upper middle class utopia. Like I have this other pet peeve, which is like about all the coastal restoration, which is wonderful. And there's so many good pedagogical projects aimed at children and young people learning about the coastal environment, the marine ecology, all these things. And the young people I work with, they think it's great that there's so much focus on that, but like, how is it going to help me get an education so I can get a job? And it's not, it's like hobby projects for a different sort of.
That was thanks. That was an interesting question, and slightly depressing, but absolutely provocative answer. Do any of our authors have questions for each other? I know some of you have been in conversation with others, but perhaps not in this format. So go for it if you have a burning question. Otherwise, my last question to those of you who would like to answer this is where next? After writing this paper, did you feel like there was a burning question that the writing process provoked in you that you haven't quite been able to address in this paper and would like to explore next?
I'll go first then, based on the previous order we've done. Thanks for answering that as well, by the way, Frederik. I think my computer buffered near the end, but I got most of everything. Yeah, and internet. So for me, this is like, in some ways, Burcastle is like the most exciting aspect of these militarized gardens, because now, like, it might not just be a one-off in Ireland from this period, but now that I need to really go back to these 18th century ones and really look at like the motives behind why people make things. You know, is it this idea of like national pride? Is it, you know, projecting masculinity and what have you? So really, I need to go back to all these ones, which up to now people have only really talked about as these little curiosities, and is there a way to weave them all together? And if not weave them all together, can they be categorized through some of them, like sort of, you know, were they erected with this national pride in mind? Is it just a case that, you know, it was built by a local eccentric who liked reenacting battles? You know, it's now trying to, you know, I've got about 50 examples I've found so far, and it's a case of, you know, trying to, you know, make sense of it all essentially now. So yeah.
Frederik, what next for you?
That's a very pressing question, as I just finished my PhD before summer, and now I've had a very long vacation and have basically this week started to think about what's actually next. But I just wanted to say again, thank you so much, because I feel it's very hard writing about these action research processes, and they don't fit very neatly into the sort of output formats for academia right now. But this particular special call and the whole process around it really helped me to take some first baby steps into it. So I'm just super thankful.
As are we. Thanks, Frederik. Elza, what about you?
So when the call for the paper, I mean, special issue came, I was just submitting my PhD and I was kind of frustrated about what was happening and the questions that were unanswered in my PhD, and there's something that I took forward from there. And in the process of writing and the mentorship and all the discussions, I was looking at how even in different contexts, land becomes a really important aspect, not just a landscape. So right now, I'm sort of orienting myself towards looking at food production and contemporary emerging practices of food production in South Asia, and I mean, trying to take it forward in some way.
That's great. Thanks, Elza. And finally, Koenraad.
Yeah, I already mentioned it. So for me, this opportunity of writing this paper for the special issue was great because I was actually already long time thinking since year 2020 about building a project on compensation landscapes. Writing a funding proposal that didn't get funded, but of course I did some preliminary research, and so this paper was great to publish that preliminary research as well. And I think it also helped me in sharpening what this project could be about. So now I'm doing it. I'm studying some European cities, so Berlin, Rome, London, and I'm still working on Flanders as well. And so I hope to write a book on it and really compare these different sites. And sort of the small comparison is already there in the paper, but I'm extending that sort of reflection. And in the long term, I hope really to sort of continue working on ecological urbanization, this idea of ecological urbanization, and compensation landscapes are a part of it. And so I also hope to look more internationally at what happens in other continents as well. But that's really long term. But so, yeah, I think this was a great opportunity for me. Then I also just finished my PhD when sending in this abstract. It was a great opportunity to sort of open up what I wanted to work on further.
That's great, and congratulations, all of you who have managed to finish your PhDs. Great stuff. I'm going to hand back to Zana now to end this.
That's great. I'm going to hand it right over to Charlotte, who will wrap things up really, really quickly. But really, thanks everybody for coming and listen. It was amazing listening to these papers. I'll hand it over to Charlotte to wrap it all up.
Yeah, just to echo Zana's words, thank you so much to our editors and all of our speakers. It was incredibly insightful. So thank you so much for being here and for all the work that went into your articles. We're really, really excited to share this recording and your articles alongside it. And hopefully the special issue will come out any day. For those of you that don't follow us on social media, please do, because then you'll get the notification when we share this recording. And just all of you to have a wonderful evening, day. Zana, for you to enjoy the rest of your night, because Zana joined us in the dead of night. So thank you. And I'll say goodbye. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.